If you were here last week, you know we began our kind of series for the Christmas season. And I want to start this morning by reciting a story, a fable that I came across a number of years ago. Some of you may be familiar with. But I heard this story once of a king who was more wealthy than any king before or since. He had everything he wanted, everything at his disposal, except the thing that he wanted most. He wanted to find love and he wanted to be married. Now, the problem wasn't a lack of opportunity. There were plenty of females in his kingdom who would have loved to become his queen. Besides his wealth and his power, he was also known to be kind and just. But the king was concerned. How did he know he was marrying the right woman? Would she be marrying him for love or just because he's the king? More than anything, this king wanted to be married. And more than that, he wanted to share his life with someone. He wanted to share his heart with somebody. And so one day he's outside the palace when he sees a peasant woman. And there's nothing special about her, but she caught his eye. And for some reason, he was captivated by her. And as he watched her from a distance for a while, he realized he was falling in love with this peasant woman he didn't know. Why he loved her was hard to explain. She had no wealth, no social connection, no political influence. It didn't seem like she had anything to offer him, but he loved her regardless. But how could he express his love for her? And so he asked some of his advisors what he should do. And they said, well, you're the king. You can do anything. Why don't you just command her to love you? She's powerless to resist. You can just take away her freedom of choice. But he was a wise king, and he knew whilst he could force her body to be in his presence and his palace, there was no way he could force her heart to be his. So then his advisors suggested he look on, find someone else, find someone more worthy to be his queen, someone of noble standing in the community. And he tried. But as the days and the weeks passed, he could not stop thinking about this peasant woman. He began to think maybe the best way to win her heart was to shower her with gifts. You know, in a moment, this king with his wealth and everything that he owned, at the click of her fingers, he could solve all her worldly problems. But he wondered, how would he know if she loved him for who he was and not for the gifts he'd given her? So he realized there was only one thing he could do. One day he got her up, he removed his crown and his royal robes, and he left the palace, and he lived in the dump, scratching a living out of the dirt. He groveled for food. The king became as ragged as the one he loved, because it was the only way. If you were with us last week, we opened up the scriptures in John chapter 1. We're gonna be there again this morning. John chapter 1 tells us about the arrival of this king who puts on flesh, moves into our neighborhood, becomes as ragged as the one he loves. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. This king Jesus had a rightful place in heaven on his throne. And then in Luke 2 and 6 and 7, it says the time came when the baby was born and she gave birth to her firstborn son. So she wrapped him in a cloth and placed him in a manger because there was no room in the inn. And so this king left his royal status and he became as ragged as the ones he loved because there was no other way. And this is the gift that we celebrate at this time of year, isn't it? It's this celebration when God becomes flesh and he dwells here amongst us. And God, out of his great love for us, he gives us this amazing gift. He comes to earth and becomes as ragged as the ones he loves. Yet this great gift of God that we celebrate this time of year is often a gift that isn't warmly received. If you were here last week, we talked about the different gifts we may have received as a child. And how sometimes there was always that gift that was practical and perhaps even something that you needed, but it wasn't necessarily something to get excited about. And we said it's kind of like getting socks or pants from your grandparents. You know, there's always those gifts that I could practically put this to use, but it's not that exciting. And so none of us want socks and pants for Christmas, unless you're in your 40s, and I quite look forward to it. But it isn't that exciting, is it? But at least socks and pants for Christmas serve a purpose. But you know, there are some gifts that serve no purpose at all. And they are the last thing we want. It's the last thing that we want to receive is a gift like that. And I'm sure we've all experienced that moment, have we? And it's always slightly awkward. You know, someone places this gift in your hand and they're excited and they're smiling and they're so pleased to give you this gift. And you're thinking, what the hell is this? And you're kind of slightly nervous because I'm not sure this is something that I want. I remember one year my cousin, he received a gift from our grandparents and no one could work out what this gift was. It weighed nothing. It was like wrapped up in Christmas paper, but it weighed nothing. And every time you let go of it, it floated up to the ceiling. And you've got to remember this is the 1980s, okay? But my grandparents thought they'd bought my cousin a space-age pillow. In fact, what they'd bought him was a shiny silver helium balloon. It wasn't quite what you buy a 12-year-old for Christmas. So, you know, we've all had gifts that we don't want, gifts that serve no purpose. And you know, statistically, this Christmas, you will receive a gift that you don't want. And you're likely to want to either return it or better still, re-gift it. Okay? You know, there's this unspoken rule. If you put a gift in a gift bag, you don't fill out the tag because the gift bag is a gift as well. And of course, you can then pass it on. So why don't you turn to the person next to you and tell them maybe one gift that you have received that you didn't want. Be careful because they may have given it to you, okay? But think of just one gift that you may have received that you didn't actually want. You wish you could have returned it. And your marks, get set, go. Okay, I did a little bit of research this week. I discovered Last Christmas, a huge £1.4 billion worth of gifts were returned after Christmas. And according to a Madison and Mayfair website that I visit quite regularly, there were at least 10 things that were likely to be returned. And number one, shoes, kitchen appliances, sunglasses. Who doesn't need sunglasses? Makeup. Yeah, I would return that. Skincare products, houseplants. Returning houseplants. Here's one. This is worthy of return. Scented candles. Video games, although you buy them online now, don't you? Video games, glassware. Anybody receive glassware? And the last one was a musical instrument. Okay? So if you have purchased any of those things in the last couple of weeks, you might want to keep the receipt. Okay? Just in case. So we all have those gifts that we don't really need and we don't really want, and we would just as sooner return them than keep them. And surprisingly, that's exactly what happened when Jesus was born into this world. As expensive a gift Jesus was, the expensive reality of what Jesus did, He gave up heaven for earth. He laid aside his throne and his robes, and he came and dwelt amongst us. It was a costly gift, but on the whole, it was a gift that was rejected. If you've got a Bible, we're going to be in John chapter 1 and verses 10 and 11. And it says this. It says, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. So God gives this gift, this wonderful, costly gift, but it's rejected. It's returned. And the word that we see there in verse 11, received, is a Greek word, which is paralambano. And the word paralambano doesn't just speak of an act of receiving. It also speaks of the spirit in which something is received. So it's not just accepting something, it's embracing something. It's receiving something and taking it on to oneself. It's personal. It's a personal gift. It's not opening a gift and then kind of like moving on to the next one. It's opening it up and taking delight in this gift that has been given. One of the ways that this word paralambano today, we kind of express that is in marriage. You know, when a minister or a vicar leads a couple through their vows, he says to the groom, do you take this woman to be your wife? Do you paralambano this woman? Do you receive her? Do you delight in her? Do you love her? Do you embrace her? You see, this is the right response, that the gift of Jesus should be given, but it's not the response that Jesus received. He wasn't warmly embraced. He wasn't received. Now, I guess we would agree that at Christmas time, at this time of year, when in our culture, people are a little bit more embracing of Jesus. They often get him confused with Santa Claus, but, you know, there's a little bit more of an embrace of Jesus at this time of year. You know, you walk into various shops in central Milton Keynes and Boney M's playing, you know, and you hear, you know, Jesus' name over the airways, as it were. And that seems to be quite acceptable this time of year, you know, in the kind of public realm at Christmas. Now, typically, if it was June or July and the shops were playing songs about Jesus, then it probably wouldn't be okay, would it? People would get a little bit upset. But this time of year, it seems acceptable. Why is that? And I think culturally, it's perceived to be okay because most people like the Christmas Jesus. Okay, most people like the baby, born in a manger. They like the Christmas Jesus because he's not very offensive, is he? The Christmas Jesus is often warmly embraced by our culture. There's this great scene. I was going to play it and then there was too many swear words, but there's this great scene in the movie Talladega Nights where Will Ferrell, his character, what's his name? Ricky Bobby. Has anybody seen this movie? Am I the only one? Me and Sam are the only ones who have seen this movie. All go home and watch this movie this afternoon. But in this one scene where his wife says, you need to say grace. You need to say grace before the meal. And he prays to the baby Jesus. And she kind of gets a little bit offended by this. He grew up, he became a man. And he says this, he says, when you pray, you can pray to whatever Jesus you want to. You can say it to the grown-up Jesus, the teenage Jesus, the bearded Jesus. But I want to pray to the Christmas Jesus. I like to pray to the chubby little baby Jesus. I want to pray to him. And I think in many ways that's at the heart of our culture, isn't it? People find that version of Jesus quite acceptable. This cute little baby Jesus born in a manger. He doesn't threaten them in any way. But here's the thing. The Christmas Jesus becomes the crucified Jesus. The Christmas Jesus becomes the crucified Jesus. And it says in John 1:11, his own did not receive him. And what that means is that when it says they did not receive him, is that his own, they beat him beyond recognition. They pressed the crown of thorns into his head and they hung him on a cross. When it says they didn't receive him, that's the length of not receiving him they went to. It's one thing to accept the Christmas Jesus. It's another thing to accept the crucified Jesus. So Isaiah 53 says he was despised and rejected by men. Why was that? Why was this amazing gift rejected by so many? Well, there are some obvious ones. People reject him because they were offended by who Jesus was and the message he brought. If you look at Jesus, people are fine with the Christmas Jesus, and they're probably okay as well with the miracle Jesus. Because, you bring him out at a party and he can do some tricks. He can turn water into wine. So the miracle Jesus, that's okay too. But Jesus, the preacher Jesus, a lot of people went home when they heard the preacher Jesus. In John 6, Jesus does this amazing miracle. He takes a little boy's lunchbox and he feeds thousands of people. But then he starts to speak and many people leave. Many were offended by Jesus's message. Others reject Jesus because for them to receive Jesus meant that others might reject them. Others may look badly on them. In John 12 and verse 42, it says, yet at the same time, many even amongst the leaders believed in him. So many of the Jewish leaders of Jesus' time believed who Jesus was. They put their trust in him. And he says, but because of the Pharisees, because of the kind of religious leaders and the system of the day, they would not confess their faith for fear they would be put out of the synagogue. For they loved praise from men more than praise from God. They believed, but they did not receive. They cared more about what others thought about them than what it meant to embrace Jesus. And maybe you're here today. Maybe you would say, I believe in Jesus, but I know I haven't fully embraced him. You can't fully give yourself to follow him. You can't be all in, because what would that person say? Or how would that person in my family react? There's also two really distinct groups in Jesus' time who did not receive him. The two groups were the Romans and the Jews. So what about the Romans? Well, they wouldn't have given Jesus the time of day, not because of what he did, but simply because of who he was. He was a Jewish teacher, he was a Jewish rabbi. And the Romans hated the Jews. The Romans rejected Jesus, the Son of God, simply because they didn't like the children of God. And you know, there were lots of tensions culturally going on at this time. The Romans were effectively making the Jews slaves in their own land. And there was lots of animosity between the Jews and the Romans. And you know, occasionally certain groups of Jews would raise up the zealots, and they would mount an attack, and then the Romans would retaliate. They hated these people, and they hated the children of God. They could never receive the Son of God because they hated the children of God. Jesus didn't stand a chance at winning the Romans over. And you know, it kind of sounds familiar to me. You know, I talk enough to people, you know, normal people, not Christians. I talk enough to normal people, you know, who are really kind of put off by the children of God. That people wouldn't darken the doors of a place like this simply because of Christians. And you know, if we were honest, if we were going to do an honest appraisal of ourselves, often, to our shame, that's justifiable, isn't it? It's justifiable for people. You see, lots of people have objections to the Christian faith, and they may sort of claim, you know, oh, I'm an atheist or I'm an agnostic. But what I find is, like, when you kind of like look under the hood, often that decision or that statement is attached to, like, you know, and I was hurt by this Christian, or I visited that church and this is how they treated me. Have we heard those kinds of stories? A little while ago, a fairly prominent Christian leader in the States had a fairly spectacular moral failure. And this man was well known for being quite outspoken on some of the kind of moral hot topics of our day. Particularly, he was quite outspoken about homosexuality. But then it was discovered that for all his outspokenness, that he himself was paying to have sexual encounters with a male prostitute. And I remember when this happened, I came across this article, and the author of this article said this. So you're all trying to think who it is. He says this. He says, a while back, I was having a business lunch, a sports bar in Denver, in the Denver area, with a close atheist friend. The Denver area might give it away. During lunch, he pointed to a large TV screen on the wall. It was set to a channel recapping the fall of this prominent Christian leader. My friend pointed his finger at the TV screen and said, "That's the reason I will not become a Christian. Many of the things you say make sense, but that's what keeps me away." I assumed he was referring to this man's hypocrisy. I said, "Hey man, not all of us do things like that." He laughed and said, "You've just proved my point. See, that guy said sorry a long time ago. Even his wife and kids stayed and forgave him. But all you Christians still seem to hate him. You guys can't forgive him and let him back into your good graces. Every time you talk to me about God, you explain that he will take me as I am. You say he forgives all my failures and will restore my hope. As long as I stay outside the church, you say God wants to forgive me. But that guy failed whilst he was one of you. And most of you are still vicious to him. Then he uttered words that left me reeling. You Christians eat your own. You always have and always will. And you know, that man's friend was sadly right sometimes, isn't he? He's right because you and I are just as messed up as everyone else. We get it wrong. We respond badly. We let people down. And maybe you're here today and you're not sure what you're doing because, you know, every Christian you've ever encountered has let you down. And, you know, I don't have any excuses for that other than I'm sorry. We let you down. We let you down. As God's children, we can make it hard for you to receive God's Son. And that's not helpful. And if that's you, then my prayer is that the gift of Jesus this Christmas wouldn't go unnoticed to you, simply because the wrapping is a little flawed or a little crumpled. You know, Christians, those who follow Jesus, aren't perfect. In fact, Christians are a little bit weird. And if you've not met a weird Christian before, be careful because it might be you. So the Romans didn't receive the Son of God because of who the children of God were. Let's not be the case for us. The other group of people who didn't receive Jesus, and I think the group that John is speaking to in this passage, was the Jews. In verse 11 of John 1, he says, he came to those who were his own. You know, Jesus was born a Jew. He was born into a Jewish community. And they did not receive him. They didn't receive him. And you know, the reason why the Jewish people didn't receive Jesus as the promised one, as the Messiah, and remember, they were looking, but the reason they didn't receive him as their promised Messiah, because Jesus wasn't the kind of Messiah they wanted. He wasn't the kind of Messiah they were expecting. See, they had their own idea of what the Messiah would do and how he would act. They were thinking military leader. He's going to raise up an uprising. You know, he's going to overthrow the Romans. He's going to reign over us in peace. And he's going to set everything right. And everyone is going to be free. And for a while, Jesus does a few things that kind of feel a little bit promising. But he didn't quite meet their expectations. And so when Jesus didn't do what they expected him to do as the Messiah, their cries went from praise to crucify him. And so they went from praising him and being marveled by the things that Jesus did to saying, crucify him, crucify him. And you know, sometimes we see the same thing happen. There are those who reject Jesus, often those who may have had faith in Jesus, may have even grown up in church, but for some reason, life doesn't turn out the way you hoped. And so they walk away from Jesus because he hasn't saved them the way they think he should have saved them. He hasn't been the kind of Messiah they think he should have been. Let me tell you something about God. As a gift giver, he likes to give surprises. And do any of you have those kind of people in your life who They love to give surprising gifts. It always makes me a bit nervous. And I'm one of those people who I hate unwrapping presents in front of anyone else. Tammy's family, they all love it. And you've got to kind of put on this act to kind of oh, thank you, But we all have those kinds of people in our life, don't we? They love to give surprising gifts. And they give you this gift to open, and it might be in this tatty old box. And you're thinking, what is this they're giving me? This isn't something I want. But the more you open it, eventually you realize it's exactly what you want. And I think God is like that. He's a surprising gift giver. Sometimes we fail to see the gift that he's putting in our hands. But as we unwrap it, as we begin to see what it is and see who he is, we see exactly what we want. When Tammy and I wanted to have children, we realized fairly quickly it wasn't going to happen without some intervention. And I was involved. But it was going to require some visits to the doctor. It was going to, those of you who think, visually now, dying. It required some visits to a consultant and some medical intervention. That's where I was getting to. And, Tammy finally fell pregnant, and with our oldest daughter, Rachel. But then that pregnancy was full of lots of complications. In and out of hospital. On three occasions, we thought we'd lost Rachel during pregnancy. And then 9 months is over, the time comes for her to arrive. And, we've got the birthing plan. And Tammy says, when I get into the water, I want to wear these clothes. And suffice to say, when she got into the water, she told me to go away in extreme ways. It didn't quite go to plan. And actually the plan for the birth didn't go to plan. Rachel got stuck. And then they couldn't find a heartbeat. And the next thing I know, Tammy's on an operating table being cut open for an emergency C-section. But then all of a sudden, after all that pain, after all the months of waiting, after the moments of trying and the heartache and wondering, will this ever happen? All of a sudden, there I am. Tammy's as high as a kite, but there I am holding this baby in my arms. And she's perfect in every way. She's everything we wanted. Now, she didn't come as we expected. She didn't come as we planned. But here she is now, and she is amazing. And you see, our temptation is this. When God doesn't act like we think he should, when the Messiah is hanging on a tree, when he should be overthrowing the Romans, we have a tendency to walk away. We have a tendency not to receive him. If he's really the Messiah, then why didn't he beat bankruptcy? If he's really the Messiah, why didn't he deal with the abuse I suffered as a child? If he's really the Messiah, why didn't he beat that terminal diagnosis? If he's really the Messiah, then why are we still being beat by the Romans? But here's the thing. Jesus didn't come to save us. He did come to save us. Jesus came to save us, but he didn't come to save us from the Romans. He came to save us from hell. Jesus says in John 16 that in this life, we will have trouble. We will suffer. We will have pain, but he will help us overcome our pain. You see, he didn't come to save us from our momentary troubles. He came to save us from eternal consequences. Imagine you were in a smoke-filled room and you realize the building is on fire and you're coughing and you're struggling to breathe, and you find some water and you think, I'm going to drink this water and then I'm going to get out of this burning building. And as you escape, You discover a young child who is also coughing and struggling to breathe, and you realize they need a drink as well. And so you give them the water and then you leave. You see, we have a Savior who doesn't simply give us the drink of water we think we need. Instead, he puts us on his shoulders and he carries us out of the fire. Jesus didn't come to save us from the Romans. He came to save us from hell, from eternal consequences. Before Jesus was born, the angel said to Joseph in Matthew chapter 1, "She will give birth to a son, and you will give him the name Jesus," meaning God saves, because he will save his people from their sin. There are some gifts that have no value to us until we realize how much we need them. You see, John uses this word, paralambano, to receive, to embrace, in John 1, to describe how the people didn't receive Jesus. And he doesn't use that word again till John chapter 14, where Jesus is getting ready for everything that lies ahead of him. And in a way to comfort his disciples, he says this in John 14:3, "I will come again and receive you myself, that where I am, there you may be also." And Jesus says he will receive those who receive him, that Jesus will embrace, that he will gather up to himself those who have embraced him. You know, Jesus will come again. That's what we believe. He's going to return, but he's not going to come as Christmas Jesus. Okay, some of you are a little bit sad by that. He's not going to come as Christmas Jesus. He's not going to come as a helpless baby with no room in an inn. He's going to come back as a conquering king, a victorious king. The image we see is he's not just the king, but a bridegroom who's coming for a bride, his church, those who have received him. And so not only is Jesus this unexpected gift that we talked about last time, but he's also a gift at first glance that is often rejected, perceived to be good for nothing else than to be returned. But you see, the promise is, if we are to receive him, if we are to truly embrace him and receive him fully, he will receive us as well. Amen? Amen. Why don't we stand?